Welcome to Cloud Dialogues. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Welcome again to Cloud Dialogues. Hey, Georgia.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Today we've got a special guest, Patrick Dubois, who's in Belgium. Welcome, Patrick. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Well, not for you, but
That's right. I did have a good morning.
no. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining.
We wanted to, so Georgia and I wanted to do DevOps for a while. Kind of put it on
Absolutely.
the back. There's a lot of topics we want to do, but we put it on the back burner for a bit. But then we were, discussing who to have on, and your name sort of came up, Patrick. So I asked you, and thank you for
Well, it took you
accepting.
15 years, right?
Awesome. That's right. Well, that's a good point. So I was actually going to ask that very question before we get into it. Is this true that the DevOps term was actually accidentally coined by you?
It's
Is that true?
That's the way how I see it, in a way that I was very happy with what the Agile folks were doing. And I have a system administrator background, so I was always like starting to feel the pressure from the first Agile teams and looking around them being more productive, actually more happy as well. And they were doing an event, and then I thought, like, why not do an event on all the things that I care about, which is kind of bringing things to production and all various things. And so in 2009, I did an event. I called it DevOps Days. I had no clue what it was going to be. Agile System Administration Days was too long to give it a name. So kind of that was, and I had like a pun where it says like DOD, Dead on Delivery, DevOps Days, but nobody got that in the end. Anyway, so from there, 60 people came from through Twitter, and we got together, and people were so enthusiastic that person, Nelson Smith, actually wrote up like, what's this DevOps thing anyway? And so the term kind of came from the event, and then it took on to the world. I've been, as I always wanted to learn new stuff, that's kind of how it got onto the world. And now we're like 15 years later indeed.
That's amazing, because DevOps is a term that it would be used by probably like many millions of people every day. And like, you just made it up.
Yeah, my kids keep reminding.
It took a while to get
my
traction.
Kids keep reminding, why didn't you trademark DevOps, right? Could have been. But yeah, anyway, that's another story.
That's awesome. Obviously, the topic of today is we want to talk about Gen AI and DevOps, of which, we're very lucky to have Patrick to join us to talk about that. Obviously, our key audience, Patrick, is executives, whether they're technical or non-technical. Now we've kind of covered what DevOps kind of is or where it came from. Like, how can organizations use AI in their DevOps processes? And because it feels like it's something that's being talked about a lot, but is it actually being done successfully? Obviously inside our organizations like Amazon or Microsoft, but inside organizations that maybe they're not known specifically for IT. Like, what does the landscape look like?
Yeah, so let me first start maybe with, a lot of people equate DevOps with automation, but there's obviously more. There's the collaboration and kind of working and getting feedback, and also the business aspect. The Gen AI aspect also ties into these things, but again, most people kind of see this around any of the automation as well. So some would say that the term AI is automation intelligence, right? So we all have our kind of things, but that's kind of the angle that I'm going for as my personal journey on where it brings a certain value. The fact that we bring this into our DevOps pipelines is one way of doing it. They have their own set of problems bringing the Gen AI application to productions where they could benefit from our kind of more DevOps practices such. But I'll tackle the first one, kind of bring the AI in. And just the last clarification, in the past, we had ML ops, which was the machine learning, building the models.
Of course.
Then kind of Gartner kind of made up AI ops, which was kind of more of the predictive models inside of the operational part. And then we're now at Gen AI, and nobody knows, is it now LLM ops, is it Gen AI? But the value is the best way for a technical audience, they all know kind of GitHub Copilot, right? The fact that you're writing the code and it's assisting you, and increasingly is not just helping you with that one code file, it's helping you with the whole code base. And
Yeah.
recently it's becoming the whole task and going from there. So that's kind of where, a lot of people start in their DevOps journey and getting acquainted with some of the productivity gains by using GenAI. But if we kind of bring this further along in the whole SDLC, you can also think about the product owner using this to get more IDs, kind of gaining more IDs and, for example, zoning in on an ideal customer profile. They could use GenAI to kind of iterate on their thoughts as well. So that's kind of, from the ID that comes in. Then we venture into maybe some UX, UI, some wireframing. Again, now it's more of the visual and the image kind of GenAI that kicks in because we're getting so much faster at creating those. Then we can translate that to code. So we're back to the Copilot if you wanted to. And then we kind of can create better tests with this synthetic test data that it helps us kind of, get the ID better under control. We deploy it. Hey, it's a non-event. We're all good. But then, of course, there's things like when it fails, we want to see, and we have so complex systems these days that we need a lot of help covering, like, what was the cause? Where is it happening?
Yeah, what
do I
happened?
need to do? So there's a lot of assistive parts there that GenAI can bring, support people opening tickets. Hey, if you've ever done like a system at scale and you have a failure and they're all coming at you, okay? So you want to have communication happening as well. So it can help with that as well. So you see, it's kind of, it starts with the one spark, but it just has gotten into many places that you might not think anymore about, but it's been really helpful. And you asked me, is this really happening? And I think it is, right? Like the stories are coming out. Obviously, there's internal stories because everybody's kind of like wants to keep the secret sauce and they're not really talking about this. It's and then there's
Yeah.
the overconfident things like, hey, we gain like 90% productivity. Why still have humans?
And that
Well,
seems too
kinda,
good to be true, right? That's why you question
yeah.
it. You're like, well, is this actually in reality helping people? Because I know there's always some discussion about like tooling, Gen AI tooling, like the flywheel of impact for development teams that are really mature is like on the more extreme end, right? Whereas where you've got development teams that are not so mature, it perhaps might actually be more prohibitive having all that automation in place. Like you might actually just be creating more problems. It's the same as like, what do they say? Like if you have a production line that's creating turds, it's just going to create more turds faster, right?
That's right.
Whereas if you're like, this
Exactly
is
right.
this is sort of, am I making sense? Hopefully.
Yeah. And it's actually a pattern that is known. So there's early DevOps. There was a paper that was very instrumental, which was around the ironies of automation. So
Yeah.
we've been doing automation for 15 years. And now you see this again with the ironies of GenAI automation, where if you just give the automation to somebody and it creates like a script or a code or something, and we have not 100% certainty that it's going to be fine and it's going to be okay, then when you're not completely understanding, you're very, kind of tempted to say, let's run it. Let's see what happens, right? And then it
Yeah.
doesn't work and
Yeah.
you're like, oh, well, I don't really know. So what it becomes is that when you use the automation, you still need to have the domain expertise to judge what is good
Understanding.
and what is
Yeah.
bad. So if you can't have that, you're just playing Russian roulette with automation, right? So it doesn't really help from that perspective. And that's why usually new technology is picked up a lot faster by younger people. They kind of get to know with this. But here there's still the need to have like a seniority. So
Really
to
experienced.
kind of have
Yeah.
that experience. And people say, well, the juniors, they have to fear for kind of their job and it needs to go away. But the fact is that you need to be learning before you get to the point that you actually can use the automation in a satisfied way. So
Just very briefly, you actually brought a good point with all those different areas of DevOps, because that's DevOps is actually that flow from business need, whatever that thing is, and making that a reality into operations. And then that feedback loop feeds that whole process, right? And you've covered like pretty much all the main points during that journey. It's good to note that, because some people still have a misunderstanding of what DevOps actually
No,
is.
exactly, Matt. And
It's not,
that's what what I was about to say was that having people that are tenured enough to understand that end-to-end life cycle, because if you don't have that and you're implementing automation, you're not going to be able to understand the potential impacts of that, right?
yeah, it's looking at the system as a whole, right, that you're optimizing, and not the individual
Yeah.
part. Well, there's merit on doing it individually, but obviously the more you see of the system, the more you tackle the right bottlenecks in a good way.
Yeah. And Patrick, what do you think? Because again, like coming back to organizations that are or aren't doing this successfully, like how do we qualify that? How do we know if we're doing it right or not? What is the right metric to use to measure this?
Well, I could give you the lame answer, which is ROI, but it is kind of true,
The
right?
big
So
answer. I mean, that is the big answer, right?
so there's definitely one of the pitfalls is right now is that you're doing Gen AI for the sake of Gen AI. And
Yeah,
I'm
agree.
not necessarily saying this is kind of wrong, because sometimes I would say you got to work
You're
the problem
learning,
a little
right?
bit, and
Yeah.
you're learning,
Yeah.
right? So in this
Yeah.
phase, I would say like that's okay. We can kind of deal with this, but that
Yeah.
means you're either functioning on the marketing budget, or you're still working on the innovation budget, right? So eventually that needs the materials to the product budget. And then you kind of are looking for the use case that actually brings you a certain value to your users.
Yeah.
And that could be as simple as, hey, where we used to say send email, we're going to generate the email. That's a simple thing, but we're also at the phase where this simple thing could be absorbed by another party, right? So it could be integrated in your existing mail service, and so you don't have to do it. And that's kind of like the low hanging fruit that you're bringing in.
Yes.
But often it is about having a use case that currently resolves a lot around text, because that's kind of the most powerful of creative summarization, transcripts, kind of all those powers that brings it with it. But it could also be like summarizing legal documents, or I had a person looking at contracts by saying, well, it's all good and well, this contract, but he had a set of 10 questions, and he was asking about questions on the document to AI, and he said, well, I cannot answer question number 9 because there's not enough context. And he says, like, that means there was something wrong in the contract. So that was kind of a detector. So it's kind of like looking for those like angles where you kind of enhance these things. There's a cost to doing this, and you would call this like the kind of the innovation tax, or something that you currently bring it in. But eventually when your customers start picking it up and they start using this, that's where you can see the value it brings. I did notice is that sometimes you have to ask your audience to unlearn their habits. I'll give the example. We're so used to putting keywords into Google that when you say, well, I'm gonna do semantic keyword search, and not just semantic search and not keyword search, and I ask them to ask you questions. They're not used to this, but the new technology actually shines when you're doing a full sentence question instead of having a keyword. So you kind of are in this kind of intermediate state as well. So it's not always that clear cut that you're bringing the value, because they might have to reframe a little bit of
No,
their problem to do
absolutely.
that.
Yeah. And it's like being misunderstood for a period of time. I think sometimes you've got to persist a little bit and know that it will take some time for your thing to take traction, and making those judgment calls is something that's really hard as leaders, right?
Yeah.
No, I love that. That's awesome. And in terms of, Patrick, in terms of like obviously security and risk in development and the development life cycle, do you think, like, what is the impact of Gen AI? Because I see lots of risks, but I also see lots of, potential for amazing tooling that can support us to be constantly reviewing our code and helping us to identify security risks.
Yeah, the other day I saw like a report on productivity again with the coding, and they said, well,
Yep.
we're definitely generating more code with it, and in the
Yep.
same time frame. So that's happening. But at the same time, I saw the numbers of review times actually go up as well, because
Okay.
we don't always understand what it's doing. And obviously, we
Yeah.
haven't created it, so
Yes.
we'll have to kind of understand
Yes.
the
Check it.
mental framing of this. And then the other
Yeah.
thing they saw is that the system was also creating bigger PRs than humans would do. So that they needed to find a way to kind of like tone this down as such. But obviously the same things apply, if the code is being generated, we need to have a better scrutiny of checking the code.
Yes.
That is not enough just to say, well, the dependencies were up to date. That was the easiest check, of course, but now we're actually
Yeah.
looking at the code structures. We've been working on this a little bit, with the static analysis and kind of similar
Mhm.
things inside
Yeah.
of the code. But a lot of it can be better instrumented now in a way that, we bring in not just the code in, we bring the whole context in, what it was supposed to do. So those were things that were
Got
harder in the
bit
past, because then we were just
zoomed
checking the
out
code,
view.
and now we can kind of
Yeah.
ask it for
Okay.
more context.
Within the
But
context.
obviously,
Okay. Wow.
yeah, it brings a new set of problems like, prompt injection and so on. So every technology has its own set of issues. And it boils back again to like, well, if your code is more complex that is generated, that kind of kicks it back. Who can review it? Well, the more senior people.
Yeah.
So are
Someone
we
that's
actually
more
saving time?
tenured and skilled.
That's still to be
Yeah.
seen.
Mm.
And that's a good point, because does this mean that we have to, sometimes people are not good at doing tests, for example, right? Test suites for their code. Does this make automated testing more important? I mean, automated testing has always been important to an extent, but does it make like unit testing and things like that a lot more important, or is the human review enough?
Well, if you don't know what test to write, right, your AI is not probably, maybe, you're not going to ask the AI to write that test. So it might do the trivial things like, the boilerplate we see in unit tests. We have one call and then it checks the call, right? So there's value, of course, in doing that part, but the overall is still a challenge. And there's two things. Writing tests was one thing as a catching thing for bugs, but the other was that you create an architecture that is testable and debuggable in the future. So that was the other side effect. So that is still hard to get into this, because we're just asking it like, do the one thing and focus on the one thing. But to get people bootstrapped, and if it gets you away from the blank canvas, right? Oh, I don't know what to do. Well, here's 5 suggestions. And what do you think? So if whatever we can do to engage developers to think more about the testing, I think that's still going to be beneficial in.
Obviously, I'm not a developer or an engineer, but that's one of the times when I find AI most useful is when I'm like, I'm actually not sure what to do next. And then I'm like, AI,
Yeah,
this is
helping
my
AI.
situation, can you give me some ideas? Because I am like at a dead end and I don't know what to do next. And we always have to be biased for action to some extent, right? It's like if we sit and do nothing, we're not going to learn anything. But if we do something, at least it might not work, but at least we're learning, right?
Yeah, correct. It's kind of the buddy that's there that kind of nudges you, that keeps you going.
So true.
In a certain way, it's the rubber duck. It has many flavors in there that you can bring in there. But it's interesting that we had the friction of creating tests in the traditional pipeline, traditional code. I
Yeah.
would say now with the Gen AI kind of movement kicked off by ChatGPT, we're now like a year and a half, 2 years in. People have been generating things with it and they went to production, but like in many cases, it was still the YOLO moment, right? Okay, well, looks good to me. Let's go to prod. Kind of that
Push.
was the thing.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's like every once in a while when new technology comes in, obviously the first thing you want to do is get value out of this. We discussed about that, right? So you want to bring this to production. You want to have this kind of not perfect, but you want to get the feedback from the end users. And this is also, very emerging. We don't know exactly. So like we need to
Yes.
have a lot more testing with the end user in mind to see if there's a case. Now, let's say, a year in, people have kind of figured out that, hey, the models are changing all the time. My prompts need to be changing all the time. The combination of my prompt, my business logic, and everything breaks. So the industry is now, getting stronger about evals, which is the equivalent of kind of the writing tests. What makes it very even more annoying is that it's undeterministic. So imagine writing
Yeah.
things that are undeterministic, but you need to have that safety net, right? Even if it's not perfect, just going out and doing a change, even if it's a semicolon in your prompt, right? It can break the app quite easily. It's nice to see that people are taking this rigor, and it's a technique, obviously, that comes from testing the LLMs themselves, but now it's more applied to Gen AI applications. But the fact that this comes secondary is, in my opinion, normal, right? Value, and then we create more safety, we come more repeatedly. That's the CI/CD, kind of journey we were on. And people ask me, well, how do I get my team on evals, right? So it was the same journey. Like, how can I get my team to write like tests? It's like, okay, probably, but you don't want it to happen. Probably the best thing is they screw up, because that's been over the career. The one thing, if you have the scar and then you start thinking about the safety.
You've
If
learned,
you're
yeah.
still, yeah. And it's sad to say, but it's also why we architect safe systems to allow these kind of failures to happen. So
To
you
occur,
don't
yeah.
get burned by them as well. And that's kind of
Fail quickly.
I guess the next phase is where, I have this, train of thought in my head. So, hey, we were happy writing automation code in DevOps, and that's kind of the Gen AI. Then we had the CI/CD testing, evals, and we're getting there. Slowly, we're going to get into observability and monitoring right now. So you see kind of people reusing the evals in production to know if nothing has changed there as well. Then we got to resilience engineering, which is the design I'm talking about. And then you can think about like chaos engineering, where we ended up is that,
Yeah.
well, we haven't trained for failure because, the machines is doing all the work. Let's train again all the time. So you see the whole spectrum that might come back, and will it have saved us time? We don't know, but the abstraction layers will improve. And that's where we're able to go faster. And that's the saying, like, if you want to go faster, you need to have better brakes. And that's, I guess, the thing that we're going to build in now with the Gen AI things as well.
We've covered a lot of the challenges that are like, what did we speak about? We spoke about obviously skills is important, having people that can really kind of deeply understand your development landscape in order to assure the introduction of this type of technology. And then what else did we talk about? Yeah, I mean, like testing and how we scope for testing and make sure that the testing that we have in place is appropriate as our code evolves more quickly. What do you think are some of the main challenges that you see with Gen AI in DevOps that executives need to be thinking about at the moment?
Well, there's certainly as much as the automation helps us, there is still quite a fear of losing a job, yes or no. So it's something
Yeah.
that you need to be aware of as a leader. And one way is about showing the productivity, the better life, how it helps them as an engineer.
Yeah.
So that's one of a way of bringing it. By the way, one company we noticed that they wanted to introduce GitHub Copilot, and already 25% of the developers were kind of buying it themselves. So that it means that they see the value. But
Yeah.
I also saw people say, well, we saved so much time, but we're not going to change our estimates because why would we, right? So there's a
Yeah.
little bit of a friction
Yeah.
happening
There's like
there.
operational practices. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Obviously, the people side is like getting that, being constantly mindful of that is really essential as a leader.
Yeah. And then the other shift that I typically see is that one, and we touched on it briefly, is when you are from the creator, the coder, you're moving more to the manager of systems, that you kind of the reviewer, and that will
Yeah.
only increase. And then maybe, in the future with agents, that will keep evolve. So people might have different skill sets that they need to evolve in to kind of like, be better at risk assessment, be better at kind of
Yeah.
bringing things together, maybe get closer to the business value to this. So that's kind of a journey, but it's too early to tell, but there's some signs that kind of bring it in. Whenever you have like a new abstraction layer, you kind of like move a little bit higher on the stack, and your job will kind of evolve on this. And that might mean
One of the,
also middle management is kind of maybe having a different type of job
a bit nervous.
eventually. Well, not nervous.
Yeah.
Well, we're all nervous, right? It's not that, the CEO can also be replaced by AI. But
Probably the
um,
easiest replacement, Patrick.
well, that's your word.
No,
So
I'm joking.
Depends
I'm
who it is.
joking.
I see the number of podcasts people drop
Not if
right
you're
now.
good. Yeah, good point. It's a good point.
They're all bots listening to you, right? So
Absolutely.
but yeah, kind of that rethinking on what we're good at. On the one hand, people think there's kind of reduction in force that's supposed to be, but again, it will be compensated maybe by the training. I
Yeah.
also, the dynamic of, will we have like smaller teams, bigger teams, that's still kind of, are we going to be more productive? Some would say like, finally, we're going to get to the backlog. I don't think that will ever happen, but it's
No.
kind of like, those
Never
kind
get
of
to the
like team
backlog.
dynamics will be interesting to see how that will change. I have like anecdotal story about a person that, in a factory, they were using GenAI to bring in training, and instead of the team getting smaller, actually they became bigger because the onboarding was a lot faster and they spent less time on education. So that means they were able to be more productive in a way. So for them, it was indeed of like producing more. So if you have the capacity and the demand for producing more, then obviously, there's that still worked. So anyway, that's the socio-technical impact of the whole technology on kind of how we're going to move. But we might be over exaggerating again, because obviously there's a belief that we're going to get like every year better. That's still to be seen, right? There's always every year a new narrative on getting better. But
I think things are always slower to happen than we think they are. Like it always takes longer for things to eventuate than we think that they will.
Oh, the best practices around Gen I, and we're still learning that, right? And it's only been really a year and a bit that we've had that. And it'll probably take, even though it's a quickly moving technology, it's going to take a while for people to pick up the best ways to do things.
One thing that I see in a lot of organizations that I think is going to be aggravated by Gen AI is a real, understanding of the whole pathway to live and actually having like a strategy around how that should work and revisiting that, however often, as opposed to all these little different things going on in different areas of the business and not really having a complete view. I feel like that's something that I see in a lot of organizations. And I feel like AI is almost going to aggravate that by providing more productivity where you don't really have a strategy as to how that is going to get to production.
Yeah, that pressure will indeed build up. If you can, somehow get faster, then it becomes clear on, kind of where the bottlenecks are, where the value add is
Yeah.
happening,
Yes. He gets
such.
aggravated, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's definitely something that executives need to think about as we progress on this journey and put structures in place. They may not necessarily be perfect structures, but put some structures and mechanisms in place as to how we're gonna, collectively think about our pathway to live and make sure that we assure it over time as AI develops as part of
yeah.
DevOps.
And let's
Um,
say the situational awareness, um, we've gotten better at reporting, but if you're at sea level, you have your weekly reports and they're always out of date. You kind of like there's a whole struggle, right? There's a whole kind of
Yeah.
a lot of people working the whole week to get you a report. So
yeah.
kind
That's
of
right.
bringing that
Yeah.
more closer to reality is definitely something that
Mm,
will help there and kind of will open some eyes. So, oh, this is what it really is. And you're like, I can now do some of the control queries that I wanted to have as a check. It used to be, I don't know who it was, but there was a person like installing like 15 different monitors or like to keep up to date with everything. Now the AI is just saying, well, here's all the data. Well, tell me what changed and what do I need to look at? But again, you can't just trust it to say the right thing. So you still have to have like an
no.
understanding of what's going on. But the
Yeah.
speed at which you get the information to make decisions can likely go up there.
It's quicker. Yeah.
As long as you know how to manage it, right? Like this still has to be a strategy. You can have all the data in the world if you can do something useful with it.
Reduce the noise and
Yeah.
amplify the signal.
Is there anything else that we want to cover before we close?
So I've been personally digging into how do you bring Gen AI into the organization? Where does it fit in? So my hypothesis is a new technology typically starts with a pilot team and you bring it in. It might be in this case that there are more data science people involved and they kind of do your first pilot. I think
Yes.
depending on your product, you go into, we all don't want one team to do this. We want like multiple teams to work on this and you want to scale this out. And eventually, if you want to scale this to all of your teams, I see it personally move maybe closer to the platform team. And one of the reasons is that there's so much kind of infrastructure that is new, that's kind of has its own set of problems. The vector databases, the semantic search, the LLMs, the training, the fine tuning. It's like a world on its own. And then we do want to have the developer experience on top of that and enable the teams to use this. So we kind of see the similar pattern. And then eventually we bring the governance in, like, okay, we need to make sure that the wrong data doesn't end up in the wrong place. We're doing the licensing, not just on the coding, on the libraries, but on the models. So you kind of see the similarities there. And that's kind of, if you're further and growing, that might be a path. And it's interesting to see that world comes from obviously an ML ops data science. I did a raise of hands where I was like, well, who knows like team topologies? And 5% in the new room actually knew about it. So we're kind of at, different parallel universes somehow. Like the one part has learned it
Yeah,
and the other is
exactly. Yeah.
rediscovering. The same thing with automation. We've done this for 15 years. Oh, well, cool, new automation. So kind of a cross-pollination. And then it's interesting because then you can bring in all of the learnings we did around access control, going to help us with agents and kind of the things around monitoring and testing, we bring them back. So kind of that's something I've been kind of thinking about and how to bring this in.
Patrick, you just literally gave like a roadmap to AI for executives in the space of like 30 seconds.
That's right.
That was amazing. Like, I think you just gave me a light bulb moment. I'm going to go and talk to all of my customers about it now. That is amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for
Oh,
coming. And if you haven't read the book, that's the book.
yes.
Do you have a Gen AI version of the book, Patrick, coming
Oh,
out?
come
or is that a
on.
secret?
I think it's too early. The patterns still need to settle. So
Oh,
It is, because it'll be out of date by the time
yeah,
you've written it,
so
right?
thank-
But, yeah. Anyone who hasn't read the book, definitely get it. I think I've got an original edition, I think, but I think there's been an update a couple of times, has there?
I feel like we need another
Since it
episode on
originally
this,
came out.
Matt. I feel like we need another. We need like in that thing that what you just said there, Patrick, is like
Gen
we
AI,
need a
yeah.
whole. We need a masterclass on that. Like that was amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. I
Yeah.
feel like you've just given me
Thanks for
so
coming.
much, just like on a just me as an individual. Like that. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you saying yes and coming on
Mm.
to our little show. And thank you, listeners, for listening. And we're always happy to
Comments,
take feedback.
questions,
So please
YouTube
send us
comments,
feedbacks.
or LinkedIn.
Yeah, like and subscribe, all that
Please,
stuff.
yes.
We appreciate it. And share with your friends as well. Share with your friends and colleagues and enemies if you want. That's fine.
And don't
That
forget to
doesn't
follow
bother me.
Patrick
And follow Patrick on Twitter
and
or X
LinkedIn.
or whatever we call
And
it these
LinkedIn?
days. And LinkedIn.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Amazing.
He's on both. Cool. No worries. Thanks for your time. Thanks, Georgia. And we'll see you all next time.